Distinguished delegates, members of the press, activists, and supporters. A very big welcome to everyone. It is now time for plenary number 8 to begin. In this plenary, we are going to talk about something that could be a rather touchy topic. We're going to talk about the D word. Yes, that's the D word. Now, before you begin to think about all the possible D words, let me give you a hint to the one that I'm referring to. It's a word that conveys the idea of trying to dismantle systems that were put in place a very long, long time ago by people from the West upon people who are not from the West. Does anyone know the word I'm talking about? Decolonization. Thank you so much. Very good. So this is a topic that affects every single one of us sitting right here in this auditorium, whether you understand that or not, whether you acknowledge that or not. Because colonization, in its various forms, has impacted all of us. Take me, for example. I speak English as my first language, yet my name is Chikodinaka Odua, and I am the daughter of Ashinyeli and Nonyelong. My homeland, the home of the Igbo people, was colonized by the British. Therefore, colonization has impacted all of us, all of our lives, from the languages that we speak, the names that we bear, the gods that we worship, the foods that we consume, the clothes that we wear on our bodies, the careers that we choose to practice, the way we define beauty, the way we define success, the way we treat one another, the way we hire talent, the way we even see one another, the way we work with our colleagues, the money that we value, the people that we choose to advocate for, and even the people who we choose to care for. Colonization impacts and influences every single one of them, all of us. And some of that impact continues to glorify and promote certain people while oppressing and dehumanizing certain people. We are all here. We have all traveled here to Kigali, Rwanda, to be a part of this beautiful gathering of people because we are all connected to the international development system. But guess what? Even that system of international development has been tainted by the stain of colonization. So how can that system be decolonized? We are also all here as champions of gender equality. Many of us would proudly beat our chests and wave our cards and call ourselves feminists. Yet, even that movement of feminism, the global movement of gender equality, has been stained by the colors of colonization. Decolonization, that's what we're going to talk about in plenary number 8. My name is Chika Odua. I am a writer, a poet, and a journalist, and I'm very excited to moderate this panel. This plenary will actually feature 2 panels. The panelists will take a critical and honest look at the power structures and dynamics within the international development system. A thought-provoking conversation on dismantling harmful colonial legacies and fostering equity for all. That's what you're in for in this very panel. We're going in to courageously address this pressing topic. This is a call to go beyond getting a seat at the table. This really is a call to break down white supremacy in the institutions that we work for. Now, I would like to invite the speakers for the first panel on stage. Come hither. Please come, and let's actually give them a round of applause as they come forward. Excellent. We have Sophia Cinero, CARE Global Secretary General. Sophia's unshakable commitment to women and girls is drawn for her many years of experience from working with girls and women in some of the most marginalized communities of Africa, the Middle East, Latin America. Thank you so much for being here. Once again, we have Maliha, President and CEO of Women Deliver. Dr. Khan's commitment to feminist movements began in her native Pakistan, and she brings 30 years of expertise in the field of gender equality. Thank you so much. We also have Christine Stegling, Deputy Executive Director, UNAIDS. Her policy and advocacy work at global, regional, and country levels has helped to increase access to HIV prevention and treatment, and has also expanded sexual and reproductive health and rights. It's so amazing to have you here with us. Thank you. And we have Monica Aliman from the Ford Foundation. She plays a key role in the foundation's efforts to reduce gender-based violence and to tackle structural inequalities. Thank you so much for being here. Last but not least, we have Basit Nyambi, Director of Global Partnerships and Engagement for Planned Parenthood, a first-generation Nigerian American like myself. Bassi has worked tirelessly to advance reproductive health and rights for women and young people all over the world for at least a decade. Thank you so much for being here. All right, so this panel is called Breaking the Wheel, Reflections on Reimagining a Just and International Development System. We have about 30 minutes. Here we go. So for my first question, I want to invite you all, or to challenge you, to think of one example of a colonial legacy that continues to linger in the international development system. One example. Who wants to start?
I'll go ahead and start. I would argue that the entire international development system needs to be dismantled and is a colonial relic. But one example that we at Planned Parenthood grapple with is the global gag rule that exacerbates inequalities, particularly amongst women and girls in the global South, and that's by design. And we at Planned Parenthood challenge that system by suing the US government. And looking at also our own systems around thinking about reproductive health and rights, those have been challenged. In 1994, in Cairo, you had Black women at the International Conference on Population and Development challenging our notions around what reproductive health and rights looks like and the social justice movement, and giving us that language and advocacy around reproductive justice and an RJ framework. So it's so important that we have systems that are developed and prioritize local communities so that they're in the driver's seat for their own development process.
Excellent, well said. Another example.
I'll go. White feminism.
White feminism.
White feminism.
Do tell.
It's a colonial legacy and it permeates everything that we do. 70% of the people working in international development, particularly in civil society, are white, middle-class women. They bring with them, as well-intentioned as they are, they bring with them a particular way of doing things, a particular narrative, and a particular culture. It's insidious, and it marginalizes and creates vulnerabilities in those of us who have to learn that in order to be successful. It puts us back at least a decade, because we spend that decade learning the language, learning the supremacy of the written word. That's not necessarily where we're coming from. Learning to express ourselves in very particular technical English and ways of phrasing that don't come natural to us. It brings with it a privileging of educational qualifications, which most of us don't have access to or get access to much later on.
Right.
And it also brings with it a particular work culture where we struggle to fit in. And we put all of this as this is our culture, and we say it proudly. Let's name it, let's shame it, and let's break it down.
Excellent, thank you. I'm curious, Malia, what does the narrative sound like? You talked about a narrative that everyone has to rehearse and memorize.
Could you?
The narrative that you mentioned that white feminists have put upon all of us to memorize.
My first experience of that was when I came to graduate school in the US, and I was told, first of all, I had to learn English and express myself in English.
The gods have been awakened.
My apologies for the English supremacists who, but then, even when I did that, I was told that my style was colonial. Of course it was colonial. That's the colonists taught me how to write.
Right.
And then I was told I wasn't technical enough. And then I was told I wasn't present tense enough or directive enough. And so I had to break down every step of the way, learning and relearning and relearning. And then people, you know, look at you when you get to this stage, and I'm sure many of you had it, and say, where have you been all this time? Oh my God, we didn't even know you were there. And I was like, it's taken me 30 years to get here because of all the hurdles.
Thank you so much. Sophia?
Well, quite similar. I would use the word top-downness. It's everywhere. The top-downness, we feel it. I mean, and this sector, of course, was created in colonial times. And of course, it has still that flavor. I think it still carries the colonial virus with it. And it's manifested in so many ways. For example, unless you speak in a very elevator speechy way, unless you have your 3 points you want to make, if you want to tell a story, you're simply not listened to. So and you need to know your stats. And because I do know my stats, let me mention 2, which I think are quite shocking. Just 1.2% of all humanitarian assistance was provided to national and local organizations. And guess what? Only 0.13% of ODA to women's rights organizations. So right there, you have colonial flavor, and right there you have colonial evidence.
Sure.
And maybe just one more thing which bothers me the most, which is the entire system is looking south and is looking to the global south, toward us. I'm from Uruguay, from Latin America. And most of the underlying causes of Uruguay, of Tanzania, of Egypt, of India, of everywhere in the global south actually reside in the global north. If the world would be a country, it would be the most unequal country in the world. But most development assistance is looking like south, each country at a time, its inequality, its poverty. When? If the world would be a country, it would be the most unequal country in the world. So guess what? We actually need to address the underlying causes of poverty that reside in London, in Berlin, in Paris, everywhere. And we are just focusing way too much in this sector on looking south when we have to look globally and our solidarity.
Sophia, you used the word bothered to talk about how you feel. I have an inkling it's deeper than being bothered. So which word actually describes the way you feel about this colonial system in the systems where you work for?
Well, I joined this sector in '94, and I was actually quite shocked with what I found, because from the outside, you think it would be different. You think it would be having all of the values that we are talking about here in this forum, in this conference. And I'm driven by the feminist slogan of nothing about us without us. And yet, what you find in the development sector is often not that, where many decisions, funding decisions, what needs to be done, projects, I mean, we have to kind of fit in a log-framey way into projects that were often not designed in the global south by the global south. So only just for the global south, and there's a big, big difference there.
Right, excellent. Thank you so much. Any more contributions? Christine, Monica?
Well, you know, to me, the one example of what colonization represents for this sector is our endowments our money was made by our ancestors. That money was taken away. That money is sitting in the banking system in Europe, in the US, and in other places of the world that are still the key holders of power and money. So to me, we should never underestimate that money belongs to us. So the very existence of those institutions, of my own institution, is the symbol of colonization.
So the entire world financial structure is a remnant of colonization.
Yes, but I am not saying it in general terms. I am saying the very existence of institutions like the Ford Foundation, like the Gates Foundation, like many other institutions that were created on the backs of our ancestors because the conditions were set in place for certain people to have the money that could be then generated and elevated to another level. That's not to say that we are not doing good or that we are not trying to do good, but we have to recognize that we come from a legacy of colonization, oppression, and exploitation.
Excellent. I'm curious to hear what you're doing to change that at Ford Foundation, but I'll get back to that on the second round of questions. Christine?
Yeah, thanks. I think I want to start by agreeing with what all my fellow panelists have said, but also acknowledging that I'm obviously one of the white middle-class women working in the sector. And I take that very seriously. When we sit on a panel like this and we talk about a system and institutions, it has to start with ourselves. So for me, that is a very conscious journey. It doesn't need to be a public journey, but it needs to be a journey that you do individually, where you ask yourself every day, what is my personal bias? What is my privilege? I know I'm extremely privileged now. I work in a very senior position in the UN. I have a lot of power in some ways. And so for me, it's an everyday thing, asking myself, am I using a lens of my privilege, of my bias? And I think that's really important to put up front before I make any other comments. I was thinking, answering the question, around colonial legacy in our own areas of work, I wanted to point out that all of what we have said is true, but we also have some examples, especially in the HIV movement, where we tried to turn it on the head. And that was because of the power of communities, so the reminder that communities fought against a very biased, racist, and unjust system of access to medicines 30 years ago, where white, privileged people, not always privileged people, had access to medicines, and this entire continent didn't. And we didn't sit with it. We all stood up, we fought for it, and we got access. We didn't change the system entirely, but we showed it was possible. The other one is funding. Creating funding systems like the Global Fund, where we actually decided that it is the country, that is communities that decide what is needed in a country in a very collaborative, not always stress-free or unchallenged environment, what the country needs. So there are examples that we can build of in a broken and challenging system. In terms of our own work, I keep on thinking, one of the things that comes up in this conference everywhere else is this issue around sexual diversity and homosexuality as a Western I don't know how to best say it. It's something that came from the West. It's un-African, it's un-Indigenous, and so forth. And that is colonial history, right? We know that every culture, every country had sexual minorities, had expressions of sexuality that were really oppressed with the colonial powers that came, and were made worse by funders, by a whole history of putting money into non-progressive powers that have put us in a situation where now the narrative has changed to a point as if LGBTI communities were un-African or un-Indigenous or not part of our cultures. And that's one of the big colonial legacies that we deal with or that we have to work with as UNAIDS.
Sure.
And one of the things I need to keep on saying, I think here's a moment where those that have colonial history, when they express their disappointment with countries like Uganda or Kenya, or there are many now, they don't actually reflect back on what their own involvement in that history is. And I think, you know, before you shout at others, you should look into yourself and say, where did the money come from? Who has funded those? And where's the actual history of that coming from?
So Christine, you mentioned that you noticed that access to HIV treatments were racialized. Why would they be racialized? I'm just curious.
Why?
Sure, access to HIV treatments.
To be honest, I think it is money. You know, it's racism, yes, but it was money, it was profit over people. And I think the saddest part of this is we see this now, right? When we look at data, even in countries with good access, with good prevention HIV programs, we see that Black and people of color are always more affected. Women of color, Black women are more affected with HIV, even in countries that have good access. So there is a bias and there is a structural choice. And there's an issue about profit. We saw it with COVID. We had not learned a thing from the HIV response, right? Right there, we were back at rich countries having access to COVID vaccines and poor countries having no access. And nobody challenged the system. It was all out of a sudden about supply and demand and IP rights and all of those things, as if we hadn't learned what was most important was that people had access and that we hadn't changed the system. We hadn't changed the system. We don't have local production. And I think this is something that there's a lot of us who are very, very invested now to change, that we produce medicines where they're being used and that we don't get into another pandemic where we face the same situation.
Excellent. So we've talked about language, we've talked about culture, we've talked about money systems. Let's now talk about solutions. Can you all think of 2 concrete steps that your institutions are already embarking upon to change the system, to really break down white supremacy? 2 very concrete steps. Bessie?
Sure. I mean, I would say that at Planned Parenthood there was a mini riot where, you know, young people in particular, but our colleagues in Latin America and Africa were really calling for looking at our financial institutions and the way that we fund our funding mechanisms to be able to work with partners in solidarity. We say that we're working in partnership, but we have these financial structures that have so many barriers in terms of the reporting process. And so what was so important was that we worked closely with we had leaders that were committed to doing this work and working closely with our financial institutions to say, okay, this reporting structure that you're putting together doesn't actually speak to the realities of what's on the ground. You're asking for things like, you know, car insurance, and knowing as a Nigerian, there's no car insurance in Nigeria.
Right.
Like, how are they gonna, you know, provide that? So it's not actually speaking to the country context in which we work. So really focusing in on those specific structures in which we work in, and then out of that, we started to develop something called the This Is Brave Fund, where we are using flexible, unrestricted funding to provide access to funds that are focused on SRHR, advocacy around LGBTQ+ rights, advocacy around combating the opposition and misinformation, and so really putting forward funding that our partners can access and decide where it goes, okay, and then be in the driver's seat of their own development.
Is this happening in Planned Parenthood worldwide or just in America?
At Planned Parenthood Global, we work across 10 focus countries in Latin America and Africa, so it's really happening across these 2 regions, but we really want to hope to expand how we're working with our partners, especially expanding that fund to other partners. Right now, it's only with a small few of our partners that we already work with, but it's a great opportunity to show that this is just a first small incremental step in how you can break down some of those financial barriers and also break down who holds the power around making decisions around their own futures.
So following the money. Planned Parenthood is following the money. Excellent. Thank you. Sophia?
I'm glad you said 2 and not 3. So 2. We signed together with Oxfam, with Save the Children, with Plan International, with many others, a pledge for change for decolonizing our sector. We launched it in October of last year, and it has really, really, really very public and very ambitious commitments, and you can hold us all accountable to follow through. And I think that matters. And let me also talk about the practical. The very practical and concrete. I mentioned funding. What women's rights organizations mostly need from international NGOs is funding. And not just funding, flexible and multi-year and untied funding. And we have made there big progress at CARE. We are not yet there where we should be, but 55% of our resources have gone to national and local actors, and up from 25 just 1 year ago. So if in 1 year we were able to make that change, I'm hoping for much more and much deeper. And we have stopped talking about subcontracting. Imagine that term. More top-downness is simply not possible. We are talking about shared risk-taking. We are talking about mutual due diligence of each other. We are talking about collaborative compliance, doing this together. All of the more boring stuff that we always get stuck on, we really need to crack this and do it in a very, very different and meaningful way. And of course, there is no one that should work in this sector should not have reflected deeply about our own privilege, our own ways of behaving. Imagine, for going, for example, to high-risk country, many in the development sector need to go like through security training and all of that. How on earth did we ever think that we can work in this line of work without deeply reflecting about colonial times, decolonizing and what that means, about white supremacy? Of course, that is absolutely mandatory, and yet we don't do that enough. So big changes both on the pledge we are making, the actual concrete tools to get funding to where it matters, and of course, a deep reflection about how we're showing up in the world and what we're doing.
Is this pledge an internal document, or can we all find it somewhere online?
You can find it all online. I hope Degan Ali was here yesterday on this stage. She is actually the mastermind behind it. She brought us together from Adesso, from a Somali NGO, and she pushed us to really develop the pledge, sign the pledge, and everyone is welcome to sign it, and not only to sign it, to actually walk the talk and do what the pledge includes, which is about equitable partnership. It all has a language of reciprocity, mutuality, sisterhood, feminism. And ethical storytelling is a big part of the pledge as well. And of course, influencing that wider sector that I mentioned, where most causes of poverty reside, because that's where we need to really place our attention.
Great, excellent. Malia, any pledge signing at Women Deliver going to happen anytime soon?
We haven't signed on the pledge yet. That doesn't mean we won't. Sophia won't leave me alone until I do. But what we have done is do two things. I'm breaking it into two, rather craftily, because it's actually more than two. One is we've looked very, very closely at the racist, white supremacist roots of the sexual reproductive health and rights sector. Let's acknowledge that. It came from a place of controlling the bodies and fertility of Black and brown people. So that was step number one. And I think Women Deliver went through a very public reckoning, and we did that. Step number two, which is to me the much more important one, so that we can stop, looking in the mirror and crying and saying, oh, we're better now, is about what does it take to move a global organization like Women Deliver to being an INGO of the 21st century. How do we leave behind those colonial legacies and actually serve the global space, acknowledging our privilege as a northern organization? And what do we need to change? We've identified 3 areas of change there. We need to change all the ways in which we do our work, programming, as it's called, because we've got those structures that are coming again from a colonial enterprise. We need to change our narratives. We need to change the way we talk, the way we describe things, the way we own things, the way we privilege ourselves and our technical expertise. And the third thing we need to do is we need to change our business model. As Sophia said, and pointed out to the ways that they're trying to do it at CARE and the other INGOs, we can talk the talk, but until we fundamentally question where we're based, who makes decisions, how we treat other people, what do we think is compliance, right? Who's driving the narrative there, who makes the decisions? And if we can't change that and shift that, we will always be playing lip service to decolonization.
Excellent. And Christine, 2 ways. Oh. Monica?
I can go. What can I say? I mean, it hasn't been easy. I come from an indigenous community in Central America, and I made the US my home. And I am proud of that decision. But joining this sector and joining an institution like the Ford Foundation and joining the philanthropic sector as a path in my work for justice has meant that I have had to go through a process of my own internal change, because the microaggressions, the non-microaggressions, the real aggressions are real. They happen every single day. They are in the way we are interacting with each other, in the way we interact when we make the case for resources. So I will start by saying that it's not easy to be part of that community when you decide to drive change internally. What the Ford Foundation and others have done is to try to shape the face and the composition of the staff by bringing people like myself. There is pain that comes with that, but it is a path that the institution has taken. And of course, they provide a level of accompaniment and support, but that doesn't mean that you don't get hurt in the process of trying to make the world a better place. We are doing that from the highest levels, from who is our president to who is our board members, to who is the leadership and the face of the Ford Foundation. And we believe that this is the only way we will begin the process of redefining what progress and what dignity looks like. Because it just happens that for many of us who sit very comfortable in the global north, we decide what progress and what dignity should look like for you, or for anyone. So we realize that it requires shaking the whole system and changing the face, so that then when we are discussing what are the problems and what are the solutions, the people around the table look and think and feel differently. And I will say those are some of the things that we are doing.
So shaking the system and changing the face. Excellent. From the Ford Foundation. Thank you so much. Last but not least, Christine, USA Ideas.
Yeah, it's a bit more complex maybe, speaking for the whole UN, which by definition should actually be a place where we come together with respect, with tolerance. But I think there is a growing recognition within the UN that there is racism, there are deep levels and deep-rooted racism at all levels of the UN, and there's strong kind of marching orders to everybody to address them. So everybody does that differently, but we have to remember we are membership-driven institutions, so it's quite an interesting dynamic how to deal with that. But the thing you can do is to deal with your own staff and your own policies and the things that you can control. And so as UNAIDS, we're really committed to a feminist and anti-racist agenda. It comes from our executive director, Winnie Byanyima. And she has appointed people like me who she believes will be able to run with that agenda. So the journey is long, and it won't happen immediately. And I think even before I joined UNAIDS, when I ran an NGO, I was always a bit tentative to sign any pledges and commitments, because I feel what we really need to do is that really hard internal work. How do you provide safe spaces for people to talk? How do you provide safe spaces for healing from racial trauma, from organizational racial trauma, but also individual trauma? How do you provide spaces where people really talk about oppression and power imbalances? That's not easy in any organization, and definitely not easy within a UN organization. We're committed to it, we're on the journey, it will be a long journey. So that's one. The other thing I was going to say is, it's also important to think about how, obviously, there's also something about us as leaders, how we role model what we say and what we commit to. So that's a given, and how we hold each other accountable for that. And then the third thing is, coming back to my earlier point, in this system, in this global system, as a UN agency, if we take the space and speak out about those issues that are coming from a colonial history, we're always going to make one part of our member states unhappy, right? If we speak on behalf of the LGBTI community, there's one part of the member states that are unhappy. If we speak against the IP structures and access to medicines, there's a whole other lot of member states that are unhappy. But we have been speaking out, and we proudly do so. And we know that it has consequences. It has political consequences, and sometimes it has financial ones.
Excellent.
But we're really committed to doing that.
Thank you so much. So a hopeful outlook from UNA Ideas. Beautiful. Now it's time for closing thoughts. I would like to challenge all of you to finish this sentence. I want to see a decolonized international development system in which, Malia?
In which brownwashing and blackwashing of leadership is not enough, and we deeply question every single aspect of how we work, what our business models are, what our narratives are, and most importantly, why we exist.
In which we will have no room for endowments, and we will recognize the urgency of the moment and respond and put the money on the table right now, because it's needed. It's needed by feminist funds, by women's funds, by women's rights organizations, by civil society organizations that day in and day out are responding, because we are refusing to take responsibility as power holders. So that is the system. That is the system I want to see, one in which the money is in our hands.
I want to see a decolonized system in which, Bessie?
In which we're not having this conversation again in a generation or two. It's so important to remember that the international development space is not meant to stay the same. It is literally meant to develop and evolve. And if we're not working ourselves out of a job, then what are we doing here? We have to recheck our own priorities. So it's so important that we remember that these same faces shouldn't be here in 20 years, right? We should have young people, people from the global south, people from marginalized backgrounds who are leading the way and being brave in that, and continuing to not only challenge the system, but take action.
Christine?
Hard slog to follow. I really wish that we got to a development system where it's about people and about issues. I think we are wasting a lot of resources, a lot of time, a lot of effort by not really getting to what we really want to change. And that includes not including everybody's voice and not making space. And obviously, for me, it's all about making space. And I liked what Pumzile said yesterday. There's a special place in hell for women who don't make space for other women. And I think that goes for this conversation too.
Excellent. Sophia, it's on you.
In which the statistics I earlier mentioned are turned around, where most of the funding goes to women's rights organizations, to young leaders, and where truly we work in global solidarity in a very, very different way, and not as is. As is should not be anymore.
Beautiful. A round of applause for our beautiful speakers. This was amazing. Thank you for your candor. Thank you for your consideration. Excellent. And this may very well be the last of the conversation. All right, then. You may now exit the stage. And I'd like to invite the second set of panelists to come forward. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you so much. What a fascinating conversation. The next one is going to be just as fascinating. So is everyone ready? I hope we're not tired. Give us some energy. So our second panel is actually going to hone in on feminism, because we have to define what feminism means. Oftentimes we find that feminism applies to a certain culture, a certain belief, a certain narrative. So the second panel, we're going to take another look at how feminists should approach their work, thinking of inclusivity, thinking of different cultures, and thinking of more broad narratives. So I'd like to invite them forward. We're still getting set in the back. Okay, here they come. A round of applause, please, as they make their way forward. Thank you so much. Thank you, thank you. You all look fabulous. You can take your seats. Introducing our speakers, we have Tarcia Rivera Zea. She is the founder, yes. She's the founder of the Continental Liaison of Indigenous Women of the Americas. She champions ancestral culture, trains Indigenous leaders, and combats all forms of violence. Thank you so much for being here. And we have Chantal Umuhoza, Executive Director at Spectra, Young Feminist Activism. Chantal is a Pan-Africanist and feminist activist based right here in lovely Rwanda. Thank you so much. We have Auntie, if I can call her Auntie. She said I can call her Auntie, so I'm going to do that. Auntie Gillian Gallagher, the Chief Executive Officer of the Victorian Aboriginal Community Controlled Health Organization. Thank you so much. And Jill has been instrumental in helping to grow a team of more than 100 people supporting about 32 Aboriginal communities. Thank you so much for your commitments. We have Arisu Najibzadeh, Manager of Canadian Programs of Oxfam Canada. Arisu is a rising voice for women's civic and political leadership in Canada, and she was recently recognized as a young woman of distinction by the YWCA of Toronto. Congratulations. And then we have Aisha Constable, founder of Girls Care, Climate Action for Resilience and Empowerment. Aisha is a climate researcher and practitioner who applies a feminist approach to her work. Thank you all so much. Another round of applause. So we have about 30 minutes for this panel. Each of you are working tirelessly in your separate spaces. I do want to acknowledge and appreciate that there is some overlap in what you all do and what you all believe in. However, I want to ask targeted questions because the local context is so important when we're talking about feminism. So I want to start with Tarcia. For 40 years, that's not a small number, you have been advocating for the rights of Indigenous women of the Americas. Can you mention two important ways that international systems can incorporate the knowledge and the practices and the leadership of Indigenous women, the ones who you advocate for on a daily basis? The mic, just 1 second. Try again? Okay, we're gonna switch it out for you.
Now?
Perfect.
It's necessary to say that this item, decolonization, is very important to see in the external issues and in our proper life, in the personal attitude. Because we had many legacy, not good legacy, from colonial time. We as feminists or as women, we had the blame from the religion, Catholic religion. Why we are continuing repeating that we are blamed because we have the right to be happy in our collective right and our personal life. With this, I think it's necessary to build a bridge between us, between the differences. You mentioned our knowledge. This last time, we are very sure that Indigenous women's knowledge is very useful to confront the principal problems in our countries and in our societies. We believe in collective rights. For example, we are talking the climate crisis, the system. I think we need to recuperate the vision of collective rights for all, not only for me or who are doing the best. The issue of recuperation of the equilibrium in our relationship between us and between our ecosystem, the Mother Nature, because if we believe on that, it's because we are still now trying to use what the Mother Earth gave us for life, and we need to take care about that. But we need to include this recognition, respect, and to be consulted when some program or activities are related with us from anywhere, from funders, from international cooperation, in national programs, because we need to be part of the change, not as beneficiaries, because we have all the capability. We can share with you what is good, for example, when you are not on a spiritual health. We need to see that. The body, the spirit, the emotional, but the material too, the conditions for our life with dignity. I think we can share many knowledge, attitudes, and issues to build a new way of relationship, but it's very necessary to struggle about the power and bad use of power, not only economic, all kind of power. When we have a small power, we need to think in all of us, not only individually. That's why we are very happy to share the knowledge of the right to collective right related to with our individual rights in our proper body, in our proper culture, and in the society.
Thank you so much.
With full of life for everybody.
Thank you so much. And with 40 years of experience, I know you have a lot of knowledge to share. We really appreciate you for being here. Thank you for the insights. Chantal, can you mention 2 examples of colonial legacies that really frustrate you, that you see happening in feminist spaces?
Thank you. I think it's really difficult for me to talk about legacies, because for me, legacies is what is left. And for me, the definition of colonialism is not just the act, but the system of operation which still exists today. So I will not mention legacies, but I'll just briefly say, for me, the definition that I'm going to use is one that encompasses all systems of operation. We're talking about patriarchy, capitalism, racism, all other issues that we know that when they're together continue to oppress systems and communities and people in different ways. So with that definition, I know that feminists are trying so much to encounter all these systems of operation in different ways. However, they're embedded in contexts that are equally affected by these systems of operations and power inequalities. So therefore, for me, we need to generally rethink and dismantle and reform the system as a whole. So the two things that I want to talk about that affect the feminist movement, here I don't want to talk about the movement as a whole, but individuals within that movement that identify, whether identify or not, but are doing work that can generally be described as being part of the feminist movement. Because we know there are those that don't want to associate, but from the definition of feminism, we know they are contributing, and the feminists before us have paved the way for us to be here, including here today in Rwanda, and for this Conference of Women Deliver. So the first thing, leadership is in the wrong hands. And that is also a replication of how the colonialization as an act happened. You do not have the developed versus the developing. You don't have the developed leading the narrative, the agenda of what is development look like for the people that are in the countries, for the communities, for women. It should be coming from those that need to be supported. And therefore, those that are being identifying as to be there to help, they should be able to listen and to provide genuine solidarity, but not to lead the agenda and to force what needs to be done. This applies to how international organizations and local NGOs as well, because they're copying the whole model, operate. So we do not want to listen to what needs to be done. Instead, we come in with our own ideas, which continues to be power dynamics that, that really make sure that this system of operation continue to exist. So this needs to change.
So leadership at global levels of institutions, yeah?
It's at all levels.
Okay.
It's at all levels.
But you're referring to feminist movements, organizations, institutions.
Institutions, and also this also gets replicated at community level as well. So the other thing I want to talk about is how, for a very long time up to today, feminists are talking about and calling out the use of a siloed approach. And this, for me, is a replica of the divide and rule of colonization, where you have groups that are working on GBV, on this and this and this. It's also, it has a face of patriarchy, because more so you see the feminist movement are lacking when we're talking about macroeconomic issues, are lacking when we're talking about conflicts, are lacking on issues that have been for a long time considered as the men's area. So then this replica affects how we operate. It divides our efforts, our resources. This is the same as divide and rule, and therefore this needs to change. And that's why feminists are calling for an intersectional approach, which is also mixed with an interlinkage approach. This means that you cannot fund one issue and then ignore that these people, this community, are not going to be affected by another issue. We can talk about health, education, but also issues around conflicts. Speakers earlier talked about how we have systems of operations where one-way donors and NGOs and feminists are talking about this issue, but at the same time we're silent when there are conflicts, but at the same time we're silent when we have countries from the West that are funding arms and rebel groups and all that. So these needs cannot exist in separate silos, needs to be together.
So, Chantal, let me come in here. You mentioned leadership.
Yes.
So when you look at the leadership of feminist institutions, for example, you go on the website and you see what the leaders look like. How do you respond? How do you feel, typically?
About
the leadership of the feminist institutions?
That, I think the previous speakers did talk about that, but for me, what I need to add is that it needs to change, because the power needs to be in the hands of those that need
My question is, how do you feel? How does it make you feel? Talk about your emotions.
Yes.
Frustrated.
Yes, frustrated. Frustrated, but that's why I'm here. If we have been able to work on these issues, I wouldn't be here, but I'm here because I want to keep us reminding ourselves that these are issues that we need to fix if we're genuine about change and social change.
Excellent. Frustration is good at times. Auntie Jillian, you've been advocating for Aboriginal women for mostly your whole life. Can you just mention 2 ways that institutions can recognize them, to make them feel as if they're part of the system?
Wow, that was a different question than I thought I was reading. But before I begin, can I please acknowledge all my fellow panellists? Thank you very much. And also acknowledge Rwanda. Thank you for having me here. I'm a very proud Gunditj Mara woman, a First Nations woman from Australia. And before I answer that, I just need to give you a little bit of very short potted history of what happened in Australia. I'm not sure your level of knowledge, but my people, Aboriginal people in Australia, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, have lived on that continent for 60,000 years plus. 60,000 years plus. My ancestors walked with dinosaurs. My ancestors walked across the land bridge between Tasmania and Australia, which is now an ocean. That's how my ancestors witnessed volcanoes erupting in Australia. Our people have been on that continent and nurtured that continent for thousands and thousands and thousands of generations. Then something happened 250 years ago. Colonisation started. It was brutal, it was quick, and it did a great deal of damage to our ways of knowing, our ways of being, and our ways of doing as an ancient culture. It had humongous impacts on our cultures. You mentioned it in your opening remarks about speaking your language and your tongue. Our people were rounded up and put on missions, treated like animals and herded like animals and shot like animals. For 250 years, the First Peoples of Australia have been oppressed and disempowered, and hope left our lives. When we talk about feminism, it is a white construct. What is feminism when you talk about ancient cultures? What does it mean to me? There's a Aboriginal woman back in Australia who doesn't call herself a feminist, but she is. She's a titterism. Titter means woman, sister. And so she's changed the narrative for her to fit within her culture. Over the years since colonisation in my country, there has been feminist movements, but Indigenous women have never been part of that. We've never been asked to be part of that. You just got to look at this conference. How many Indigenous women from Australia attend this conference? 3.
Just 3.
Just 3. That has got to change. We have got to get our women, our Indigenous women, who have gone through horrific crimes, human rights crimes. And later on, I'd like the opportunity to tell you about some of those human rights crimes. And women, our women did get impacted in many ways in relation to colonisation. There was a lot of forced sexual activity. There was a lot of rapes. White masters took our women. That happened in Australia. But how many of our women around the globe know that? This is my first opportunity to be on a global platform, to tell our stories.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you very much. There's got to be some hope. 2 solutions that you see that we can implement to recognize these stories you speak so well of.
Is that another question?
Yes, please.
Oh, sorry. I think back in Australia, we need to do a bit of work around ensuring that our women, and we need resources for that, ensuring our women access the women's movements right across this planet. So that needs to happen. There needs to be a lot more thought. And this is the first time I've ever heard of this conference as an Aboriginal woman. And it's amazing. And I would, next time, if it's in Melbourne, if it's in Melbourne...
If it's in Melbourne, yes.
I will ensure a lot of Indigenous Australians will attend that conference.
Thank you so much. Arizu, tokenism. Is that a problem in feminism today, tokenism?
Well, my name is pronounced Arizu. It's
Arizu,
okay.
Arizu.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
Actually, when you asked the question about leadership, I wanted to just jump in and take over the mic, but tokenism is something that's plaguing the feminist movement. And even, again, not a criticism of you, and it's something that we're all guilty of. Our obsession with representation politics and filling numbers with certain types of people and calling it quits is going to be our demise. You know, representation politics, this misunderstanding that if a person who looks like me, who sounds like me, is occupying a center of power, is going to be representing the needs, the ideals, the aspirations of my community is an illusion, right? It's created this illusion of inclusiveness that usually takes Black, Indigenous, racialized women, disabled women, trans people, and expects them to represent the entirety of their communities and all of their diversity, while leaving them with no supports, with no resources to make meaningful, actionable change that brings their communities forward and brings everybody else with them to ensure that they're not the only one at the table. And it's this double-edged sword that a lot of, again, myself, a racialized woman, a lot of times we kind of like fall into that trap. And again, just the burden of having to represent your community in all of its beautiful colors and shapes is not one that I think any one person can carry. And we continuously see that happen, specifically in the global north, to Black women in politics. And you know, they get elected and then they face racism and they're expected to do all of this and that for everyone. And they're so easily put aside when they actually rock the boat and try to do what they're there to do. So I think for us, in order to address that, we need to kind of look deeper at ourselves as individuals and as a collective movement and recognize how colonialism, oppression, white supremacy culture is defining our ideals of leadership. And how the people we call leaders are people who are more often than not, following that example of the confident white man in front of the room, you know, banging his fist, shouting at everyone, versus the type of survival leadership that Indigenous communities, disabled communities, transgender communities have been doing out of survival for hundreds of years. So being able to recognize those components of white supremacy cultures and how we define leadership is going to be key in recognizing the work that is happening on the community level, the work that feminists and women and trans folks in all of their diversity have been doing for years. And I mean, some examples of that are, especially in these spaces and in mainstream liberal white feminism, this obsession with quantity over quality. Of let's have 50% women in politics, let's fill departments with 30% women, without actually thinking if those women that are taking those seats will they actually move the needle for SRHR? Will they move the needle on abortion rights? Because I don't care if they're the youngest and the only woman president of your country. If you're not moving the leader for the rest of us, you do not represent me. You are not here for people, transgender people, for women. And I think that's the conversation that we as a feminist movement we should have. That accountability, those hard, critical conversations should be had in the open and on these stages so that we come clean with each other. This is what we are here for, and that's what we're not here for. End of conversation.
Excellent. That's why we're here today. Aisha, let's hear from you. As a feminist climate change activist, what is the one message that you really want to convey when it comes to putting your point across about the intersection of feminism, climate change, and decolonization? That's a tough one, but you can handle it.
And you only want one message?
Yes.
Because I have a few. And as someone from the Caribbean, from Jamaica, I listened as Auntie Jill recounted what colonialism looked like in Australia. And it occurred to me that had it not been for colonialism, I would myself have been a true daughter of the soil of the continent, because my people would not have been forcibly moved to the Caribbean to maintain sugar plantations under slavery systems, under colonialism. And so, you know, we live with the daily reminders of the tragedies of colonialism. And it's also very significant for me to acknowledge that we're having this conversation in Rwanda, a country whose recent history, I believe, speaks to the travesty, the tyranny of colonialism, but also whose transformation shows us what forces of decolonization and decolonized approaches to sustainable development can gain us. In the climate crisis, we, I believe, have seen the constant efforts to create systems that are supposed to be the panacea for the crisis. One of the things that I try very often to remind colleagues is that we cannot put our faith for the fixing of the climate crisis in a system that has been designed by colonial forces. All the mechanisms that have been crafted at the highest levels of leadership to address the climate crisis have been built by forces of colonization, forces of colonialism. And those systems are inherently imperialist, racist, and sexist. And so the work that we do as feminists has to challenge that. The conversations that we have now around the just transition and the mitigation actions and technology transfer, if we are not all keyed in to what that means and interrogating what it means for people at the front lines of the crisis, then we're missing the mark. Because again, these solutions repeatedly have been said, false solutions, but also perpetuate those same agendas. With technology, we see where we're being offered loans to buy technology from these same colonial powers, so that we're keeping the wheels of their economy turning through these said solutions. Who's calling that out? Are we asking those questions when we're in those rooms and calling it what it is, neocolonialism? The conversations around climate finance, you know, as linked to that, they're never open to considering reparations or reparative justice as a response to the monies required for the transformation in response to the crisis. And if we do not have a solid mechanism that facilitates the redistribution of wealth to redress the wealth financial gap that was created by colonialism, right? Financial institutions that were set up to launder financial gains from slavery that we now still are indebted to and borrowing from, and who are now issuing bonds and loans as part of this solution to the crisis, we are going to be in trouble again if we're not calling that out for what it is.
Thank you so much.
I want to quickly add this point.
Just 30 seconds left.
We're also very quick to ask the questions of how can we decolonize the system. I think very importantly we need to grapple with how do we as feminists, some of us in the same room and outside the walls, decolonize our minds, ourselves, right? How does what we do on a daily basis outside of these spaces perpetuate colonialism and patriarchy? I wondered to myself as I walked around the premises, how many of us truly see the women who are refreshing those bathrooms, you know, maintaining those gardens? They are the ones keeping the wheels of this conference turning, not to us, you know, and they do that as, you know, an extension of their service to the needs that we have put on the table. But do we see them? And do we acknowledge that work? And it's the same with the climate crisis. Do we see the people who are most impacted? And do we see their unique needs? And again, if we are creating solutions to meet the needs of those who are already in positions of power and advantaged, then we are contributing very much to the problem of the climate crisis.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Well, we have to end it here. Thank you so much for these insights. Very, very moving. I actually just want to take 10 seconds to just reflect. If we can all just quietly reflect. This has been quite an emotional plenary. Just 10 minutes, please. Just 10 minutes to reflect on these words. Thank you all so much. Thank you, thank you. Another round of applause. All right, you may now exit the stage. It's finished, yes, we'll have later conversations, I know, but time is not on our side. Thank you very much, thank you so much. Another round of applause for these feminist change makers. I hope you all enjoyed this plenary as much as I did, and please remember that we all have a role to play in the effort to decolonize our world. The question is, are you going to step up to the plate? Are you going to take action, or are you going to allow the status quo to linger? That's a challenge for all of us. So to close this plenary, I am so honored to invite a Rwandese artist. His name is Kivumbi King. He is going to grace with a performance. I think he's still getting ready. Kivumbi King is a rapper, a poet, and a spoken word artist, and we're in his home of Rwanda. Let's please welcome Kivumbi King to the stage.
Hello, everyone. My name is Kivumbi King. Thanks for having me. I am about to perform 2 poems, and the first one is called Chachana. It just simply means the underdog.
Red. The numbers were turning red. Did you? Yeah.
Just let it go, Rick.
Ndatambuka bakagira bati dore cya cyana cya kivumbi cya cyana icyo ntazi icyana cyarenzwe n'ivumbi n'icyicari wabo gikunda gasozi ngo ni cya cyana yego nicyo cya cyana cyataye indero ngo ni cya cyana cyataye umuco oya ndi cya cyana cyabuze umuco ngo nkukureho jyewe nkusange ese uyu niwo batuzaniye twarayobotse twarakurikiye ariko mu kuvuga abandi twabaye aba mbere bagira bati wacyana we ntabwo ujya wumva wataye indero nta muco ugira. Then I'm confused and I'm like, what? How can I lose some that I didn't have? See, I never lost it because I never had it. I never lost it because I don't even know it. So every time you tell me wataye indero wataye ingeso wataye umuco, I don't know what you're talking about. Ntago nzi ibyo muba muri kuvuga. Please hear me out. See, I was born in the post-colonial era, and that means my culture was no longer pure. Where we had a king, there's now a president, even the residents speak foreign languages. See, my culture is informal. We live in the formal world now, and that is education. Maybe my complication is that I'm lost in the translations. Nobody likes the old styles. Welcome to civilization, they say. But I wish I was born before. I learned the culture on my own. Drink the milk and see the clothes, the hairstyles, the way they talked. How daughters became wives, how wives became moms. Then I could feel at home at last, but then I ask again, why muchuri? I live with an open mind. The world ever changes angles, I'm ever ready, let it come. Stay true like I've always done. The truth, the lies, the good and the bad. See, I have seen a lot and that's why sometimes I write. Yes, sometimes, Ndicha-chan. Thank you. The next one is called Hakuna Matata. Hakuna Matata. What a wonderful phrase. It means no worries for the rest of your days. But as much as I would like to live problem-free, I still have a lot on my plate. I refuse to showcase a fake face. In a different style, I choose to write the script to my play. And Hakuna Matata is a statement I believe most of us cannot easily say. You see, I'm not trying to be a pessimist. No, I'm more of a journalist. See, for a long time, our generations didn't communicate on how to perceive the white man and break down the pattern. The pattern that started with explorers. Abaje kwiga karere. Some self-sponsored, they drew inch by inch our continent, named our lakes, rivers, and mountains. It took them years that some learned our languages. Mount Speak, Mount Stanley, Mount Baker, Lake Victoria, etc. And then came the missionaries. See, they came to civilize, commercialize, and Christianize. See, it was important to justify the supremacy of the white man, that we are destined to be slaves, we, the lost children of Ham, that we cannot think for ourselves, we are primitive and barbaric, and the only way to save our poor souls is to make them holy, white, Christian. And it worked. See, Jean Dodier and Jean-Baptiste are Rwabugiri and Nyirarumaga's children. And in another family, we have a Hassan and a Rahma. Over the years, Rahma meets Jean Dodier and they have a Thomas or a Christian who knows nothing about Rwabugiri and Nyirarumaga. And please remember, Hakuna Matata. See, we were disoriented, then colonized. Our history and identities lost and forgotten. uprisings gone to the ground with entire villages, you can ask Ngware. And after independence, we're still on a leash, that you can ask Kwame. And the question still remains the same, how do we move on from here? Because you see, if the education doesn't tell you what to question, then you question the education. And Hakuna Matata is a wonderful phrase, but I'm afraid I will have to live with worries for the rest of my days. Thank you so much.
All right, so plenary number 8 has come to an end. Thank you so much for your attention, and please be a part of the process to decolonize our world. Thank you so much, everyone.
I'm a sucker for you.